This morning we're going to be in Matthew chapter 18. So if you have your Bibles with you, flip open to Matthew chapter 18. And as you're flipping open to that portion of the scriptures, I kind of wanted to bring to light this morning something. We're going to be talking about conflict. So just be okay and be comfortable. I mean, it's going to be uncomfortable, but be okay with being uncomfortable. Okay, it could be a little challenging. And I think our world is is changing, regardless of if it's going in the good direction or the bad direction. It's definitely changing. And it seems like every morning we wake up, there is a new dilemma, a new conflict, a new issue of whatever type that there is going on, that's going on. It always seems to be something new that pops up that's going on. There are a lot of injustices that are going on within our world that are occurring every single day. I mean, we've seen within the past few weeks horrible things happening, and I think we need to address some of those dynamics. I have always been of the approach that the church needs to respond in some way, shape, or form. And so I think we need to ask the church, not just this church in general, but the church overall needs to ask a few questions of itself. What is the church's response to what is going on? The kind of the big topical issue that's going on, or big social injustice issue that's going on. What is the church's response? And then I really think we need to ask, what should be the church's response? Because you see, there's two different things there. Because the church can respond one way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is how it should have responded. So we need to look at what is the church's response, and then what should be the church's response. And then are we basing our response, whatever the church's response is and what it should be, are we basing that on Scripture and what Jesus would say? Because I think we can look at our history, not just in this country, but kind of ever since the church first started, that there have been times in which the church has definitely missed the mark, has definitely addressed an issue, that is social injustice or something that's going on in the community, and didn't do it the right way. I mean, that's a fact. Just go through church history. There's a bunch of different times in which the church has really missed the mark. And so I think we in this place, and as a denomination especially, and as a church, Big C church, we need to look at how we respond to different social injustices and things that are going on in our culture. And in an effort to make sure that the type of conversations that we're going to be having like this, we're not going to be doing it all the time, because I personally am not of the position that we should be addressing every single issue and every single thing every single Sunday. I'm not going to be the pastor that is the current events pastor that just basically is like Entertainment Tonight and goes through all the different issues and talks about them every single week. But this past week or so, I have been challenged myself, because I have not done a good job of engaging in any of it, and that's on me. I've tried not to really communicate or talk a lot about the different things that are going on in our world, so that I don't go down the road of let's talk about every single current event that's going on. And one of the reasons why is because I don't want to necessarily push a particular political agenda or any sort of agenda that I might have or that the church body might have. I think when we go down that road, it gets very dangerous. And I wanted to just tell you that while we are engaging in these conversations, I will not push a political agenda. I will not push a certain politicalness or belief from one side or the other. And if I do that, I would ask that you would, A, give me grace, and then B, throw a hymnal at me if I start to go down in that direction, okay? And we've got plenty of hymnals and books in there. So if I start to go down that road, please be gracious with me, and if I start to throw hymnals at me. Because I don't necessarily want to go down that road. But in all seriousness, someone's getting a hymnal ready to throw it at me. I just saw it. I got a few people that are getting ready with hymnals. I'm getting nervous here. That's why I decided to preach from the pulpit, because it's solid, so if I see one coming, I can duck behind it. But in all seriousness, one of the strengths of our church is that we preach the good news, right? We preach the good news, and we preach the Bible. We seek the scriptures to guide us in discussion, to guide us in how we're supposed to look at the world and things of that nature, and we do not take it lightly. So when we look at the world and we look at all of these social injustices that are going on, how should we look at it? And how should we interpret what is going on in our society? I think it's kind of important that we at least start there. Because if we were to look at the things outside of the lens of Christ, and even the church, we would probably do what everybody else does. We would turn on the news and allow the media to dictate or to tell us what we are supposed to believe, right? Or what we're supposed to think or interpret this thing. And if we are to only do that, then I think we would be in a whole world of trouble. And it would be very, very scary if we only took what the media was telling us, and that was it. Please hear me when I tell you that I'm not suggesting that we don't watch the news at all, although I try not to watch the news a whole lot because it's depressing. It can be very upsetting and stuff. And I'm not suggesting that we completely ignore the news. I'm not suggesting that we completely ignore what is going on within our world. But I do think that many of us, and Christians included, depend on the media to interpret the events and how we are supposed to react to them. So before we get into really the meat of what we're going to be talking about here this morning, I need to first say that the events of these past few weeks are horrible. And I think we could probably all agree that what has been going on these past few weeks, whether it is at home or abroad, they've been horrible. And it really has shown the worst in humanity. And as we look at these events and we kind of see what they are, and we troll on social media and we go into these different groups and think tanks and have conversation with different people, we need to make sure that we are reacting to these events as Christians would. For as Christians, we want to live as Christ lived, and we want to walk as he walked and do what he did, and that means in every area of our lives and not just the ones that we feel like being part of. So when we're looking at these terrible things that have been happening over the past few weeks and how to respond, we need to respond how Christ would respond. We need to respond how we would respond to each other if there is an issue in the church. I would submit to you that how we handle conflict in the church and how we handle issues in the church should be reflective of how we would handle issues in the world. So how do we handle issues in the church? We need to, kind of talk about that before we can really engage in the rest of what we're going to be talking about this morning. So the first thing is we need to recognize that when we are dealing with conflict and issues within the church, we need to first love one another. Period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. We need to love one another. In John 13:34, when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he shares with them a new commandment. And it says this. If I can find it here really quickly. John 13:34. A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must, not you probably should or maybe, but you must love one another. He tells them to love each other as he has loved them and how he loves. And this word love here, which is agapo, not agape, but agapo love, which is slightly different from agape. They're very similar, but there's one small difference there. It means a goodwill or esteem, which is agape. But agapo, so agape means goodwill or esteem. Agapo literally means loving with purpose with God's power. I want us to kind of think about that and kind of let our minds melt on that, kind of stew on that for just a few moments. Loving with purpose with God's power. Jesus is telling his disciples that this new commandment is to love with a purpose, and in doing so, love with God's power, the power which Jesus possesses. We must love each other with this purpose, and with a purpose, because we must do so with the power of God. Love with purpose with God's power. We first need to start there. We also need to recognize that conflict will happen. There is no getting around it. In Genesis, we read, in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, it says this. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree. You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not certainly die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' When the woman saw the fruit of the tree, and it was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took it and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it." This is when brokenness entered into the relationship between God and man. It was not God who caused this, but it was humanity. It was us who broke that relationship. It was us who caused sin to enter into the world. And in Romans 5:12 it says this, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people, because all sinned." Sin is a very real thing. Sin, which is anything that gets between us and our relationship with God, came into the world. And therefore, there will always be brokenness in our relationship with God and each other. No one will be able to have a perfect relationship with one another on our own merits. As much as I try, I will never have a perfect relationship with my wife outside of God. And that goes the same with all of you and with each other. We will never have a perfect relationship with each other unless we have God on our side, unless we are filled with the Spirit, and that is where we start, with loving each other. Conflict will happen. It's just a reality, and it's because of our humanity. It's because of brokenness. And with that brokenness that this world faces, the church also faces brokenness. However, we are to be different, right? We are to be different. This group of people should be different than the world. How many of you have seen The Lion King? If you have not seen The Lion King, then, come on. It's The Lion King. You've got to see The Lion King. Every time I hear The Lion King, I try to start the intro song in my head, and it sounds like... Anyways, so The Lion King is a really, really awesome movie. I really like it. I've seen it a bunch of times, mainly because Susan likes Disney stuff, and the kids like Disney stuff, so I've seen it a bunch of times. I saw it when I was a kid, kind of when it first came out. And in this movie, we have this cub, Simba, and long story short, he ends up running away. Something terrible happens, and he thinks he's at fault, so he runs away, and he finds this land, and he finds this pig, and I don't even know what the other character is. He's not a salamander. He's some sort of Yeah, that's a good one. Some sort of groundhoggy rat thing. What's that? I don't even know what that is. A meerkat? Okay, he's whatever that is. He's a meerkat. I know what the warthog is. That's easy. Okay, he's a meerkat. Okay, so he finds these two friends, and they kind of live life together, and he starts to grow up. And so he's kind of chilling and having a great time in whatever place that he's at. And, life is easy and wonderful and stuff. And so what ends up happening is this monkey who, I don't really know what he represents back in his homeland, back where Simba grew up, this monkey, okay, he finds Simba, and he says that his dad is alive. That Simba's dad's alive, and so he's like, what? And so he runs after the monkey, who I think his name is Rafiki, if I remember correctly. Thank you. And he runs after him, and he finally finds Rafiki at this pool of water. Okay, and it's this amazing, I think, anyways, this amazing scene in which Rafiki tells Simba to look down into the pool of water because he's going to see his father. And so he looks down, and what does he see? Sees his reflection, right? He sees his reflection. And then Rafiki says, no, look harder. So he taps the pool of water and it kind of ripples. And then he starts to see his father in that pool. And so I wonder, we are the light of the world and we need to be reflective of Christ. And so I just wonder, if you were to look into a pool of water, what would be reflected? Would you be reflected? Would something in your life be reflective? Or would Christ be reflected in that pool? We, as the community of believers, need to be reflective of Jesus in all areas of life, in how we treat each other. Right, Luke? How we treat each other. We need to be reflective of Jesus. We are the city on the hill, which the world should look towards in how to deal with a variety of different things, and how to deal with conflict. We are the city on the hill. The world should be looking towards us and how to deal with things. Matthew 18 talks about how the church should handle conflict, and it says this in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen to you, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, wherever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them. So how does the church handle conflict? One of the dynamics of my classes and dynamics of things that we're dealing with in my master's program is learning about churches, not just one specific church, but churches in general, and how they handle conflict. I've done studies on multiple different churches, and multiple studies have been done, and hundreds and hundreds of churches. And this is what has come out of those studies. The church is one, and so let me back up for a second. The church, this 1 and 1,000, whether it's one or across the country, handles conflict the same way. It's kind of a broad thing that churches kind of all over the country, whether it's Protestant or another denomination or affiliation, they kind of all deal with conflict in the same way. It usually comes in the form of someone having a problem or an issue. And it's usually not a major ordeal. It's usually something very small, kind of minor. But it still is a concern for that person. And they sit on it. And then time goes on, and a variety of people within the church community end up learning about it through one way or another. Eventually, it comes out to the leadership or the pastor or whoever's kind of in charge either of that ministry or of that church. Maybe it comes to the church board or something. And eventually it comes out a few months later. And because it has festered for so long, it ends up becoming a major, huge problem. Divisions in the church occur, and feelings are hurt, and restoration often takes a long time. Trust is broken, and the ministry ultimately is affected, or it stops altogether. In the end, the best case scenario that I've read about, the best case scenario is that people work it out, forgiveness is given, the ministry continues, but it comes at a cost. And the worst case scenario, and this is true, the worst case scenario, the church completely stops doing ministry, divides in half, people take sides, half the church leaves and builds their own church and starts their own community. That actually happened to a church that was down the street from us when we were pastoring in New York. They had an issue that was kind of started off as small, festered around, became really huge. People took sides, half the church left and started their own church. That's the worst case scenario. And according to all the blogs and articles that I have read, this is how the church kind of goes into default mode of handling conflict. Now, how should the church handle conflict? As a church, we should be handling conflict in a much better way. Fortunately, Jesus addresses this in Matthew chapter 18, which we had just read, and he says that if a brother or sister has a sin against you, and now we're going to stop there for just a second because I think we need to identify here what sin is. What this word sin is. What does this mean to sin against your brother in this context here? The word sin here is, in the Greek, is called, how you say it, hamartano. And this word literally means making a mistake, missing the mark, or to sin. I mean, I think it's kind of weird to say the definition of this word sin is to sin, but it really means to make a mistake, to miss the mark against God, and sometimes against a fellow creature, human being, what have you. And in ancient times, they used this word, sin, missing the mark. It would refer to an archer missing the mark. So when I was privileged to go to camp 2 weeks ago, we had a wonderful time. Kyle ended up actually being in the archery program there, and he had a lot of fun. And so I would sneak down during my breaks and try to show off, my archery skills. I'm so awesome at it. And I'm not sure if you can really tell. Yeah, you might be able to tell. Those are all my arrows. Those are all my arrows. Because I was aiming at your target, you were aiming at the one next to me. Except for the one in the middle. So all of those are mine, except for the one that's in the bullseye, because some kid picked it up and put it in the bullseye for me, because he felt bad for me. Which, in all seriousness, as you can see, and actually you can't see in this picture, the amount of times that I completely missed the bullseye. Now, they have this really huge wooden board in the back that probably spans the width of the sanctuary, and it goes really high, probably 10 feet in the air, just to make sure that, arrows that are missing the target, they hit it and they don't go off into the woods. I had to go look in the woods at least 3 times for my arrows because they were just, they'd fly off in crazy land. I definitely missed the mark at times, as we can see here and in the story, And in actuality, every person that was there missed the mark at least once. And while we were there, Kyle's counselor, he actually had a really nice, was it a compound bow or something like that? Really, really nice bow. And he shoots not professionally, he shoots really well. And so he would stand 30, 50 yards back and be able to nail the bullseye, which is pretty impressive. And even he, with all the training that he has, would miss the mark occasionally. No one was perfect. So with that in mind, our imperfections and the fact that we as humans will miss the mark, we will sin against each other. Sometimes this will happen by accident. And sometimes we do it on purpose. When a brother or a sister misses the mark, and either by accident or purpose, we are to go to them privately and share with them in a loving way what has occurred, in conversation with each other. Remember, Jesus says we are to love each other. So if we are to love each other, then that should be in every area in our life, and that includes in dealing with conflict. And now entering into a conversation with someone in this way can be scary, right? It can be scary. It can be intimidating. It can be very nerve-wracking, because what you're doing is becoming vulnerable and asking them to become vulnerable with you as well in dealing with this. And that is definitely challenging. But this is the first step. This is what we are to do. And we know that when we do this, God will be there, because he says in Matthew 18:20, at the end of that, he says, wherever 2 or 3 of you are gathered there, God will be there in that face-to-face conversation in love. And it is quite apparent this model is not playing itself out very often in churches. We all know that how conflict plays itself out in our world. And this model definitely doesn't play itself out in our world. And we can see, we've just seen this past week of how people deal with conflict and the horrible ways in which they deal with conflict. People are first, they're not loving each other. They're just not. People are not willing to come together to have conversation with each other. And all they want to do is yell, fight, condemn, judge, and sentence those who they have problems with. And the church seemingly sits on the sideline. And it isn't either ready or willing to engage in being the example of how to deal with conflict. Now, of course, I'm not blind or ignorant, and I'm not suggesting that these conflicts have happened just this past week. I mean, many of these conflicts have, months, years, decades, generations, years and years and years in the making of issues that are deep-seated issues. But the issues that have been playing themselves out over these past few weeks have been ongoing fighting, an ongoing conflict for decades. But I believe it is time for the church to step up and lead by example in many areas, and especially how we deal with conflict and how we handle that. And we can only lead by example if we are living that out, if we are living what Christ has taught us about how to deal with conflict. So I challenge myself, and I challenge you as well, that when you have to engage in conflict, do so in how Jesus taught his disciples. And also, do so with those in the world and those who are in your circle of influence. Would you pray with me? God, I pray that the words that have come out of my mouth have been from you and not from me. I pray that your Spirit has been with all of us in this place, and that we have heard from you and not from some pastor. God, I pray that you would help each and every one of us as we handle and deal with issues in the church and deal with issues out in our world. God, I pray that you would help us to deal with issues in the church in a Christ-like manner so that we can love on each other, so that we can help the ministry grow, and so that the outside world can look to us and at us as perfect examples of how to handle conflict. God, you want us to go into the world and to preach the good news and to influence society and to love on people. And it doesn't just stop there. We need to help and show and shape the world and show them how to deal with conflict and issues and how to work through those things the way that you have taught us to. So God, I pray that you would help us help us to be living examples of how to handle conflict in our world. God, we know that we're going to face conflict down the road in this church. We know that we're going to face conflict down the road in the world. And God, I pray that you would be there with us every step of the way, and that you would help us to engage in that the way that you have taught your disciples to, and the way that you have taught us to. That we would love each other first, and that we would recognize that we are not perfect people, and that we would go to each other. Because sometimes, God, we just miss the mark. Sometimes, God, I just miss the mark. Sometimes I just miss it. God, I pray that you would give us grace and wisdom as we engage in these conversations, and engage in conversations with people in our community and about different issues that are going on in our world. Help us to love them first. Help us to engage in conversation with them without making judgments or condemning them. God, we ask that you would be with us as we engage in these things, and we praise you for the work and the amazing work that's going to be done in the future. We love you so much this morning. In Jesus' holy and precious name, amen.